is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical
The whole
reaction.
notion of logic.
We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
The,
I mean, they should have respected us.
the whole notion of logic.
Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
And Zelensky, teaming up with J.P. Morgan and Blackrock. Here's the story from Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar.
Part here, it's pretty interesting. Let's put this up there on the screen. This has to do with Ukraine and its dealings with American financial institutions. So here the headline is that Ukraine plots post-war rebuilding effort with J.P. Morgan Chase as its advisor. So J.P. Morgan yesterday, in a deal with the country of Ukraine, said that it is going to tap its debt capital market operations payments and commercial banking infrastructure investing expertise to help the country stabilize its economy and credit rating, manage its funds, and advance its digital adoption, whatever that means. What it really means, though, is that J.P. Morgan is going to work with Ukraine to raise private investment to help rebuild and invest for future growth in Ukraine, including, quote, renewable energy, agriculture, and technology. So outside of the initial things that they say, the reason why I think it's important is that these major Wall Street banks, they are seeing some real profit opportunity here in Ukraine. I mean, I don't know, it's really disgusting to see, but of course, you know, whenever you knock a whole city down after the war, somebody's got to rebuild it, somebody's got to finance it, and it's not just the US government that's getting in on this. Also, Zelensky clearly sees this as a critical avenue, not only with JP Morgan. Just yesterday, he met with the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, to secure even more loans to the Ukrainian government. Right now, Jamie Dimon is saying that the bank has led a $20 billion debt restructuring for Ukraine last year and has committed millions of dollars of support for Ukrainian refugees. But the reason why this is the prelude to possibly something much grosser and much more nefarious, let's put this next one up there on the screen, is that we had a previous one we were going to cover back in December, but it fits with this very importantly. Zelensky announced an alliance with Blackrock for reconstruction of Ukraine. Now, that Blackrock reconstruction was signed back in December with the CEO Larry Fink. Blackrock said that rebuilding Ukraine could take, Crystal, between $700 to $800 billion. And they're pointing specifically to the new partnership where they will advise the Ukrainian government on how to structure the country's reconstruction fund. So you could see this is Iraq and Afghanistan levels of graft, if they want it to be. I mean, They're getting their little hands in this one.
I love the way they paint it like they're
restructuring their
humanitarians.
debt.
You know,
we're going to
just
help
here
them
for the
raise.
Ukrainian
Well, what's your
cause.
fee? And also, the reason why this matters to all of us is, look, Ukraine, they can do whatever they want. But here's the deal. They don't have a real economy. We're the ones who are paying all their bills. We're the ones who are going to guarantee all of their debt. We are literally running their central bank and paying their balancing their budgets right now. Our American taxpayers will be the ones who are basically guaranteeing much of this debt. And how much money are they going to make off of all of these guarantees? And these private investors, their guarantee, it might come from the Ukrainian government. That is a de facto bet on the United States government. So we're basically facilitating a massive wealth transfer.
Well, there's a lot going on here. Western capital has been circling Ukraine like vultures for years now, even before this war. Ukraine already had a lot of debt with IMF. The IMF, of course, is like a tool of imposing, a shock doctrine, and has already forced a bunch of changes to open up the economy so that Western capital could come in and profit off of their agriculture sector as one key example here, because Ukraine, of course, known as the breadbasket of Europe and of the region. Ukraine is a country that, suffered almost more than any and struggled after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So there's long been a push to, any state-owned enterprises, they need to be privatized. We need to open up markets to Western capital. So this is a more accelerated, more aggressive push in the same direction that they have been pushing for a long time to impose basically like neoliberal shock doctrine of the sort that we have, imposed in lots of places around the world. Zelensky actually gave a speech back at the end of January to the U.S. National Association of State Chambers, where he talked some about this approach and encouraging banks like Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan to come in and be part of this effort. He said, "It's already clear this will be the largest economic project of our time in Europe. It's obvious that American business can become the locomotive that will once again push forward global economic growth." He went on to thank investment firms Blackrock, Goldman Sachs, and JP Morgan. He says, "And everyone can become a big business by working with Ukraine in all sectors, from weapons and defense to construction, from communications to agriculture, from transport to IT, from banks to medicine. And I invite you to work with us right now." I think it's always important to keep an eye on the people who are profiting from a war and from disaster. And very clearly here, the titans of Wall Street are getting their hooks into Ukraine.
And from the New York Post, JP Morgan reaches agreement with Ukraine's Zelensky on rebuilding infrastructure. JP Morgan, the nation's largest bank, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky with the eye on attracting private capital for a new investment fund to rebuild Ukraine's infrastructure that's been destroyed in its war with Russia, Fox Business has learned. JP Morgan bankers spent most of last week meeting with Zelensky and his senior staff, where they discussed the creation of a fund seeded with $20 billion to $30 billion in private capital, according to people with direct knowledge of the matter. Other ideas discussed with the Ukrainian president were the creation of a bank administered by Wall Street firms that would make investments in oil refineries, roads, bridges, and other pieces of economic infrastructure destroyed in Vladimir Putin's year-long campaign to annex the country and rebuild the Soviet Union, the old Soviet Union, these people add. JP Morgan bankers were on the ground in Kiev and other cities, dodging bombs and witnessing firsthand how the war has crippled the country's economy. After a series of meetings with various ministers, they met directly with Zelensky on Friday night. As a gesture of goodwill on the eve of Sunday's Super Bowl, the bankers also presented Zelensky with a New England Patriot jersey with a number 91, signify the year Ukraine gained independence from the old Soviet Union. Fox Business is the first to report the possible creation of an investment fund and bank to help rebuild the country. People with knowledge of the matter say the plans for a fund or bank are in the nascent stages and subject to change. JP Morgan declined to comment. The big bank's expected to make an announcement about its work in Ukraine on Monday. A representative for Zelensky couldn't be immediately reached for comment. The Russian invasion has been thwarted by stiff resistance from Ukrainians with assistance of billions of dollars in U.S. and Western aid. Still, Russia is said to control around 15% of the country, mostly in the east. While the Russian military has suffered significant casualties, its bombing of key cities, such as Ukraine's capital Kiev, as well as civilian and infrastructure targets, has devastated the Ukrainian economy. The country is said to have 30% unemployment rate, even with men between the ages of 18 and 60 required to remain in the country to join the military or be subject to conscription. Jamie Dimon, JP Morgan's chief executive, has been particularly vocal about the consequences of the conflict, calling it an inflection point for the Western world for 100 years. Do we get our act together to help win this war, help the Ukrainians, help rebuild Ukraine? Dimon also believes attracting private capital will be key to Ukraine's ability to fight off Russian aggression. Zelensky announced last week he would join the bank's online investment summit with other major bank clients. Privately, JP Morgan bankers met with Zelensky for hours last week, providing him with ideas on how to attract private capital. They also recommended that he invite major CEOs like Apple's Tim Cook to the country to discuss economic development, that he meet with GOP lawmakers such as the new House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. Some Republicans are skeptical about the billions in U.S. aid being sent to the country, these people add. They also said that the weeding out corruption and eliminating graft in government will be key to attracting private capital. Zelensky was said to be receptive to the advice and understood that at some point the vast amounts of Western aid to the country will come to an end, and that private capital, which will demand a return for its investment, will be needed to rebuild, these people say. Wall Street's long had its sights on helping rebuild Ukraine, eyeing future investment opportunities as the country moves beyond its war with Russia. Blackrock, the world's largest money manager, has signed a memorandum of understanding with Zelensky as an investment advisor, and Goldman Sachs is also said to be eyeing opportunities. And also, we have, and I guess we could play this as well. Yahoo! Yahoo! This is an update on the Israeli government watch, and actually this one is by way of Mike Pompeo in a recent statement.
Obviously, the Abraham Accords were really, really important to you. You write at length in your book about your close ties to the Israelis and particularly your close relationship with the head of Mossad, Yossi Cohen. Very Saul Berenson, Tova Rivlin vibes in that section of your book. You spoke a lot about working
You're quite
with...
the historian.
You spoke quite a lot about working with Netanyahu, who is, of course, back in power. Now, he said around 10 years ago, without a strong and independent Supreme Court, there can be no protection of rights. It's what makes the difference between dictatorships and democracies. Mike, I wanted to ask you, because as you know, for more than a month now in Israel, there have been protests against the judicial reform plans that would give Netanyahu greater control of appointments to the bench. It would weaken the Supreme Court's ability to strike down legislation or rule against the executive. People say Bibi is doing this because he's currently on trial on corruption charges, which he denies. Do the protesters have a point? Is Netanyahu straying from the path of democracy? And this is a really important question to ask you, because as someone who may run for the office of the presidency, it's important to know if you feel that American friendship and allyship is conditional upon adherence to democratic principles and shared values, even with our friends.
Oh, look, we always push for that everywhere, but we also are partners and friends with nations that aren't democracies. We were talking about the relationships we have in Southeast Asia and the Middle East. These aren't democracies. They have a system that is fundamentally different than ours. The Israelis are one of the most democratic nations in the world, and that they'll continue at it. And this to and fro, these protests you're seeing, we've had protests at our Supreme Court too. But people are entitled to their own views. They had, during our time, we had 5 governments in Israel at different times. I don't want to get in the center of Israeli politics. That relationship is absolutely vital to us. It's why I wrote about it, because it was the linchpin of delivering good things for America. You said I was happy about the Abraham Accords for me personally. That's not remotely true. I'm happy about the Abraham Accords because the chance that a young U.S. Marine will have to fight and die in the Middle East someday is substantially lower now that peace and prosperity are on the march in the region. And, I wish we'd had more time and gotten further, but we fundamentally took down risk for the United States of America as a result of the Abraham Accords. And I'm incredibly happy that the leaders in those 4 countries in the United States, all the people who made this happen, Mr. Kushner, Secretary Mnuchin, everybody on our team that worked on this, we now know that if you're a mom or dad here in the United States and your son or daughter goes to a recruiting station, that the risk they'll have to go to that place and fight for something is lower. And that's just unequivocally good for us. And I'm very confident good for the region too.
I appreciate that. You told the Senate critiquing a policy that Israel undertakes is part of our democratic process. I'll ask you again.
Sure.
Is Netanyahu wrong?
Look, I try to stay out of domestic politics, but when any country gets a policy that is inconsistent with something that's good for my country, we're gonna say, hey, here's what we think. Here's what we would prefer you do. But if you look at the list of troubles we have in the Middle East, let me tell you, that doesn't make the hit parade. Let's start with the fact that the Iranians continue to hold people with U.S. passports and British passports. Let's start with the fact that today the Iranians are trying to kill Americans here at home, including former U.S. senior government officials. So when you prioritize and you only write 400 pages, you got to rank them.
I appreciate that. Let me ask you a question about U.S. policy then, because as Secretary of State, you undid the Hansel memo that called Jewish settlements in the West Bank against international law. And the reason you gave in subsequent interviews was because you said Israel was not an occupying nation. Now, I've not been able to find you stating on the record your support for a 2-state solution. Mike, can I ask you if you support Israel annexing the remaining areas of the West Bank, if you support a 1-state solution, and if Palestinians should be offered a path to citizenship in order for Israel to continue calling itself a democratic state?
Well, it is a democratic state. It is not an occupying nation. This land, as an evangelical Christian, I am convinced from my reading of the Bible that 3,000 years on now, in spite of the denial of so many, is the rightful homeland of the Jewish people. And we should support Israel in its efforts. They'll find their own way to an outcome there. It may take much longer. Our theory of the case was this. What's in America's best interest? Is it to sit and wait for Abu Mazen, a known terrorist who's killed lots and lots of people, including Americans, and given those martyrs money for having done so, to try and wait around for Abu Mazen to draw a line on a map? That's what the State Department would do. The previous Secretary of State ran back and forth from Tel Aviv to Ramallah and tried to draw lines on a map. We said that's not in America's best interest. Let's go create peace, and we did. And they'll have to sort their way through what are very difficult geographical problems, very difficult national security problems. I concede all of those things.
And just to be clear, Abu Mazen is Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. So I think he just called the president of the Palestinian Authority a terrorist.
But in the meantime, we should look out for Europe and America and make sure that we are helping these nations get to the right place. And we want good things for everyone, including those folks that live in Judea and Samaria.
2-state solution then? Do you support a 2-state solution?
I'm for an outcome that guarantees Israeli security and makes the lives better for everyone in the region.
Can Israel have that within a 2-state solution, Mike?
Only time and history and the Lord will know the answer to that.
That's good answer.
I wish I had a better answer than that, but many have foundered on this problem. Said, as we're working our way towards that answer, we should work to deliver better outcomes for all the people of the region, and we unequivocally delivered that.
One more question is, what lesson do you think America, in all your travels as Secretary of State, what lesson can America learn from its allies? What did you see overseas?
Okay, and that'll be all for today. We will see you tomorrow. I'm going to open a channel here.